Welcome back. Another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Roger Devlin back on the show. Of course, Mr. Devlin is a prominent academic philosopher, the author of Sexual Utopia and Power, and a frequent contributor to Countercurrents and the Occidental Quarterly. How are you doing this evening?
Hi, I'm just fine, thank you.
Well,
I'm
thanks for
glad to be
coming.
back.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. Appreciate it. You have this article that I don't think it's a recent article, but I saw it recently. It's the Intelligent Person's Guide to Race and Racial Differences. And I think last time we spoke, we talked about hypergamy and feminism and the pursuit, sort of this quixotic pursuit of equality between the sexes and all the trouble that's
Right.
causing. Because you're just
Okay.
going against nature, going against reality. If you're not engaged with reality, whatever political program or approach you have to life is going to, of course, it's going to crash and burn, just create more problems than it's intended to solve. There's probably a similar problem, I would say, between as we cope with the differences between different racial groups, particularly the expectation of equality, or the attempt to impose equality. If you can't get it just through performance and access, they start doing things like affirmative action, diversity, equity, inclusion, and then all of a sudden you have a competency crisis, and it stirs up resentments. It creates a sort of a false expectation. I guess you could say unfulfilled expectations, if you will, and it just doesn't turn out well. It's sort of like a political Lysenkoism, where you have this sort of this ideology or view, and it just simply doesn't apply to reality, and you keep trying to impose it, and it just doesn't work. So this article that you penned, I'll let you talk about it.
Yes, I wrote it several years ago. It wasn't a very ambitious piece. I didn't try to say anything original in it. My aim was to say as much as possible uh, about the racial issue in a single essay. I was like imagining a reader as somebody relatively new to the subject. I myself didn't really do any serious reading and on the subject of race until I was nearly 40 years old. But after I'd been doing it several years, I kind of saw the lay of the land, and so I wrote this short essay that you can read it in 10 minutes. And it breaks down the subject into, four or five pieces or aspects, and each of one, I give a short account of the main points, and then uh, uh, tell the reader where he can get more information. Some of the material comes from the writings of Jared Taylor. Some comes from the late Philippe Rushton's Race, Evolution, and Behavior. Some comes from Richard Lynn. I think I have some references to Ricardo Duchesne in there. And anyway, so it's a very simple idea, but it seems to have struck a nerve. I noticed that recently, when it was reposted at American Renaissance, it got 157 comments. And then it was taken from there to unst.com and it got 355 comments. So there does seem to be, a need for a piece like this.
Well, the notion of course, we've been sort of been trained or indoctrinated to think that barring restrictions or some sort of whether it's Jim
Right.
Crow, that everyone should be the same, more or less,
Yes.
outcomes, whether in different professions, and there aren't any real differences between racial groups, and the only explanation for differences is racial discrimination, prejudice, racism, if you will, that word. And of course, the only people guilty of it are ethnic whites.
Right, right.
Yeah. So I think a trick's been played on us. Final analysis, because then we
Well,
find out it's not about equality, because all of a sudden they don't want equality. They want their own groups, they want their own safe spaces, if you will, and black proms and black graduations, and it's only ethnic whites who can't
yeah,
coalesce or
Sam
organize.
Francis wrote a wonderful essay on that many years ago, called something like the political uses of equality. Uh, Equality is simply a convenient slogan for people who were looking to what everybody looks to do in politics, to increase their own power. And if they're starting at a disadvantage, they can say that they're demanding equality, though that's never really what interests them. Nobody is interested in being equal to others. People are interested in excelling, in beating others, in getting the most for themselves. And equality is simply a useful slogan in the early stages of such a struggle.
Yeah, and of course you have to look at in the context of events in the mid 20th century and the civil rights movement and sort of that narrative and the dispensation that came out of that narrative is that any acknowledgments of differences, inequality, if you will, um, is evil, and therefore you have to grant access. You have to somehow impose equality. If you can't get it just through opportunity, they start doing. They immediately, right after the supposed laws against racial discrimination were passed, they immediately started imposing quotas. The Supreme Court came up with disparate impact. The EOC came up with all types of legal tricks to impose affirmative action because statistical disparity became a prima facie case for racial discrimination as opposed to just differences. And the article, which basically resulted in quotas, racial, and actually discrimination against whites. At the time, the demographics were such that it didn't seem to sting as much. It's
Oh,
starting to
right.
sting more.
America was still about 90, almost 90% white at the time of the so-called civil rights movement. Yes.
So these indulgences were kind of granted, and it was assumed that getting access in the fullness of time, you would attain some level of equality or achievement. Of course, that hasn't happened. It's actually gotten worse, and there's other reasons I think for that. Social engineering, I think some societal social phenomena or movements like the sexual revolution, the breakup of the family, permissiveness towards crime, which is kind of embedded in the civil rights narrative because we're blaming the victim if we come down hard on crime and try to restrict it or keep it away from us. But in the article, you talk about how, well, in many ways, we want inequality, as you kind of alluded to or mentioned, is because we accept it in things like athletics, right? We accept it
Sure.
in
Sure.
performances. And so, and when you're saying that one group is better at one thing than the other, you're not saying they're inherently superior in a sort of an ontological sense or a spiritual sense, or you're saying that they're group differences. And as we understand things like the division of labor and the economy, these things are actually good because groups can excel at one thing, other people can excel at other things. And the only problem is that because of the dispensation of the civil rights movement and this kind of push for equality, whether it's equality between the sexes or between different racial groups, it's created a false expectation that if we have any differences, which I think is real diversity, if you think about it, if you're going to celebrate diversity, you have to celebrate diversity
Yeah.
and outcome. But
Right.
there's sort of a double think there. But I'm rambling on, so I'll let you get in there.
Yeah, yes, there's a natural diversity of talents, and that the division of labor is based upon, and that is one kind of diversity that actually is a strength. It's simply good that different people are good at different things. That's how people go into different professions and so forth, and it's normal that that both individuals and groups differ in all kinds of ways. I started by in the article by talking about since Americans are so upset at the idea that uh, of black inferiority in any regard, it's easy to point to certain examples like certain sports such as sprinting. We talk about basketball in America. That's in America is totally dominated by blacks. But if you want to look at like Olympic sports, sprinting is an example where West Africans excel.
Hmm.
And you can not only you can prove that this is the case just by looking at the results of the last 50 years or so of Olympic sprinting finals, but you can also explain why it's the case. I listed five or six physical advantages that West Africans have over people of other races that make them better sprinters. And this is normal. This is the way nature is. You never find equality in nature. You always find inequality between individuals, between species, subspecies, varieties, and among humans, you find differences between between nations and peoples. So that
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
it's important to understand that there's simply no basis whatsoever for the expectation that equality will hold between human groups. It's based on nothing whatsoever. Um, at least empirically, I guess people want to believe it for certain reasons. Maybe in some cases because some people are envious and don't like the idea that other people have abilities that they don't, or other groups have abilities that their group doesn't. But there's no empirical basis for it. It's nothing but a certain type of wishful thinking. And I myself, I don't see how the world would actually be better, would be a better place, or people happier if everyone did have the exact same abilities. I think it's hard to even imagine what such a world would be like, but I can't imagine it would be better than the world we have now.
yeah. Again, it's just, you're imposing, or one is imposing a sort of an ideology on reality,
Yes,
and
exactly.
yeah.
It's not an idea that's taken from reality. It's not taken from any kind of observation, but it's applied to reality in a kind of a weird cookie cutter way or something. People just insist on seeing things in a certain way, and the world just doesn't match that.
Well, the assumption
I
is,
have to confess, I don't understand egalitarians too well. Sometimes they're motivated by envy. Not in every case. I don't know. I
well,
don't.
yeah, I think last time we had a conversation is that despite all the agitation for equality between the sexes, the last thing women want is equality with men, and they're not being honest with themselves or the people they're interacting with, or they're not thinking it through.
Yes,
That's
yes,
another thing.
that's true. It's probably true that egalitarians of all stripes don't think their idea through. It's not possible to do an experiment. To see what a world of actual equality would be like. I don't. It would be rather difficult to organize the economy of such a yeah, of
Yeah.
such a society, because nobody would be better than anybody at anything. And so how would you choose a profession, or a way of life?
Yeah, I wake up every morning thanking God that there are people that are smarter, more talented than I
Oh yes, yeah. Think of all the ways in which we
am.
benefit,
I mean, it's
like
yeah.
having our planes flown by people who know more about flying than we do, and having our checkups done by doctors who know more about medicine than we do.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's true pretty much all through life.
Well, I guess the assumption again, this goes back to this idea that if you notice differences in temperament or cognition, you're saying they're better, which isn't the case. Again, as I
Yeah,
said
yeah. I
earlier.
make two
Yeah.
points in my article on that point. First of all, yes, it doesn't really make much sense to speak of one person being better than another person simply. You're always better at some specific skill, or you're better in some way. You're better according to not in an absolute sense, but always in some respect. And it's normal for people to be you know you you to be better than me in one way, and me to be better than you in another way, but there's no such thing as a person who is simply best. And I have never heard, in years now of working with racialists, I've never heard anybody try to claim that white people are simply better than other people. White people collectively have quite a few achievements to our name, that we don't have any reason to despise ourselves, but we are not superior in every respect. And I go into that in the article. You can
Yeah.
find lots of other people, but you can even find if you want to look, you can even find things like some of the most primitive people in the world. You can find some respect in which they're superior to whites. Somebody figured out that the Bushmen of the Kalahari, who have average IQ of below 60 are superior to Europeans in being able to estimate the size of a distant object.
Hmm.
They have this superiority because they live by hunting,
Hmm.
and it's valuable in hunting. And so, natural selection has given them a superiority in that particular skill.
Yes, exactly. Then as circumstances change, those advantages won't be quite as valuable as they once were, and that's where you get the differences. And you make a good point in the article about the differences. I guess the cognitive and also achievement differences between Asians, particularly East Asians, Europeans, and Africans, and it has much to do with their environment, of course, but also the idea that although even raw intelligence, where I think East Asians score higher than
Yes.
Europeans, but Europeans much more creative. It has to do with the social conditions and sort of how Europe developed.
That's
That
that's still to some extent this is an area that is still controversial.
hmm
Yes, Northeast Asians have a IQ something like 5 or 6 points higher than Europeans do, but they're not discoverers and inventors to the same extent.
hmm
And there's a lot to be said about that. Partly it could be there could be cultural reasons. There is some evidence for actual genetic differences that make East Asians more conformist. In that part of the world, it's even harsher than Europe, and people survived under pre-modern conditions in East Asia by banding together, by being good cooperators. So they're very, very good at working together. And this could even be seen well, it is expressed in their culture, like in China, if you compare it to Europe. The Chinese have a kind of cult of harmony. Social harmony is supposed to be like one of uh, the greatest goods in the world. Whereas Europeans, if you take a look, for example, at the ancient Greeks, you'll see they were constantly devising contests, uh, ways in which like people could be differentiated, and some superior person could prove his superiority.
yeah,
So,
the
the
Olympics, right?
Greeks, the sort of the original Europeans did not put social harmony above all other things, above all other considerations. Whereas the Northeast Asians, for all their intelligence, they yes, they place a premium on getting along. They have sayings like the nail that sticks out gets struck, which is what children are told to make them more conformist. And so you get, people who cooperate very well in groups, which can make them very dangerous fighters, for example, but inclines them not to discover new things, not to be inventors and discoverers in the way that Europeans historically have been.
Yeah. And these differences perdure. I mean, and they'll manifest differently as time goes by and the circumstances change, but you still see it today. Where obviously they have they steal a lot of intellectual property, right? And then
Oh
they,
yes, the
yeah,
Chinese have a government-run program where they are constantly scanning Western publications, technical and scientific publications, for any new advances.
mhm.
They have this like they think it's eventually the Chinese themselves hope that eventually they're going to be able to take off on their own, but until then they follow this early adapter model. If something is developed in the West, the Chinese know about it within a day or so or something. They're just they suck up information, all kinds of scientific and technical information with amazing alacrity.
Yeah, they send thousands of students here into the
Right,
West. Yeah,
right.
and then
They're
people are
all they're
shocked.
all they're all given detailed interviews when they get back about their experiences and everything they observed, and nothing seems to be too petty not to arouse the interests of the Chinese. You know, they're observers of the West, very, very keen observers of the West, more than we ourselves are. You know,
Yeah,
the
there was
Chinese
a
know much more about what's happening in America than we know about what's happening in Britain or Germany.
there was a I think his name's Daryl Hamamoto out there. I think he's out in the West Coast. He wrote a book about Asians and how they're perfect soldiers for technocracy because of this
Mm,
temperament, actually. Because this idea is they're very technical. They'll learn, but they're not really good at critical thinking. So they're good at following orders,
yeah.
and so the big push to have them rise through the professions and universities. It's where to get a class that's very very conformist and follow orders, and you don't get that rebellious spirit they see much more common with the Europeans.
What I've heard about, high order uh, teachers, professors report that, in subject matters like mathematics, for example, an East Asian can be taught to do anything as well as a Westerner can, but they don't seem to be able, if they're presented with a problem which is unlike and is not quite in the same class as one they have seen before,
Hmm.
they can be at a loss. Whereas a Westerner will kind of like use his own knowledge as clues or building blocks to tackle a problem that is new, that is not something he's seen before. And apparently the Northeast Asians are not as good at that. They have to have
Yeah.
it demonstrated for them at least once. And so, yeah, they are an imitative civilization. I actually reviewed a very good book once on Chinese industrial espionage in the West, which is a very serious matter. It's something that goes on a really large scale.
Yeah, and of course, the West, investing and industrializing China, in the 1990s, just to they could exploit the cheap labor. Uh, Now it's come back to perhaps haunt the West because
Yes, yes, yeah.
China is now the factory of the world, and as long as they make things accepting Western currency, particularly dollars, it seems to work out okay. But also, it hollows out Western economies, and not only do you maintain an industrial base, you don't maintain a human capital base, and so it's sort of a curse after all in the final analysis.
Western industrialists just
Yeah.
see the world's largest market.
Well,
And
well, there's a
yeah,
weakness right there when you've written about liberalism and the idea that it's just about the market, that society is not a marketplace. It's more to that. A market's part of society has to help,
right, 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 right,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. The West, when China opened up, we, our capitalists just saw it as like a place to sell things, not realizing that everything we sold them would go to it would be used to increase their power. They're simply, they're they're focused on increasing their national power in a way that Westerners have kind of forgotten about.
Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party, for better or for worse, sees itself as sort of it's more of a national socialism that's in effect over there now. And they see
Yes, it
themselves,
is.
yeah.
Yes, it is.
And so with industrial policy, domestic production, internal improvements, very, it's almost like a 19th century America in many ways, with the Whig and the Whig agenda, and it became the Republican
They
agenda.
call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, but you wouldn't be the first person who has characterized it as national socialism.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
But again, that's part of the weakness of the West. This speaks to uh, I guess it speaks to the attitude towards race, where we're all just human beings are interchangeable, it's fungible, and therefore, uh, racial characteristics, national characteristics don't matter. Uh, Custom doesn't matter. Tradition doesn't matter. It's all about the market. And I guess when they saw the markets in Asia, particularly the labor markets,
Yes.
they could outsource and produce things cheaper and not pay higher wages in the West. Not seeing that as maximizing profit as opposed to maximizing national wealth and
Right.
distributing that wealth evenly and creating a much more stable, healthy society. But all they saw was higher corporate profits. Very short-term thinking, actually.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
But that's part, I guess, the failure of liberalism. One of the failures of liberalism is the sort of the economic liberalism, and sort of whether it's I guess there's two different strands. There's socialism and there's libertarianism, neither of which work in the final analysis.
Yeah.
Uh, so, so you have these different. So the problem, again, we acknowledge these differences. We see it like in the crime statistics, which uh,
Yes.
creates a lot of controversy because we're told that when we notice crime, particularly among blacks, black men particularly, you're blaming the victim or you're a racist, and you just want to, as opposed you're just responding practically to a threat. Situations and immediately become uh, well, they're no longer tenable, if you will. I think it's it's if you live near a large black neighborhood or something, and that's why you had white flight. But this
Y-
is also something that's borne out in the statistics. There's a temperamental behavioral difference, which seems to frustrate all social engineering attempts to change it. Right?
Yes. A few years ago, some somebody devised an app that was designed to guide travelers away from dicey neighborhoods and got into all kinds of trouble because these all these dangerous neighborhoods turned out to have certain things in common demographically, and it created quite a stink. But right? So yeah, as Steve Saylor says, political correctness is a war on noticing. Everybody knows in a general way that blacks are responsible for a lot of crime. A lot of people who know that would be shocked if they could be shown the actual numbers. In my essay, the essay that we're discussing, the Intelligent Person's Guide to Race and Racial Differences, I simply made use of a couple of color of crime reports from the New Century Foundation from American Renaissance, and some of it is quite shocking. Black Americans are 98 times more likely to be arrested for shooting than whites in New York City, or if New York were all white, if you subtracted all the non-whites in New York, the shooting rate would drop by 97%.
Mm,
Blacks are 39 times more likely to commit a violent crime against a white than vice versa. 136 times more likely to commit a robbery. These are huge differences that are not common in the social sciences. Sociologists often deal with very low correlations. If you can find a correlation of zero point 0.1 or zero point 0.2 between two populations, that's meaningful. Uh, it's really only in regard to race and crime you find these simply enormous differences, and that obviously points to natural differences between the races. Blacks are not simply less intelligent than whites on average. They tend to be present focused, not to think as much about the consequences of their actions. They're a lot more impulsive than the other races. Um, when people migrated out of Africa into colder climates, uh, one difference is they had to think more about the future. They had to plan for the winter. They couldn't just live in the present. In Africa, food is available year round, so people kind of live from day to day in a way that is simply not possible in a country like Sweden or Japan. So again, the explanation is simply natural selection, evolution.
yet, yes. So you have these behavioral differences that are you could say are at least somewhat related to biology and genetics, temperament, these things, intelligence, these things. Nevertheless, these things obviously can be improved or modified as circumstances change. Human beings, all after all, they are adaptable. They do adapt to these situations, and given the right incentives, the right culture, behavior can improve or it can get worse.
Oh
And
yes, like
yeah.
the black crime rate did not used to be as high as it is now in America, when white behavioral standards were strictly enforced, and we
Hmm.
had, did so unapologetically. there wasn't as much black misbehavior.
Yeah, that's one thing you see. And I was reading an article just even the civil rights movement, even black writers of the 20th century, people like Robert Wright, um, Ralph Ellison, uh, uh, the girl who wrote woman who wrote The Color Purple,
Oh yeah, Alice
uh,
Walker.
what was it, Lorraine Hansberry wrote Raising
Yeah,
the Sun. They're all indoctrinated by communists and all had Jewish handlers, promoters, and they're indoctrinated with this sort of ideology, leftist conflict ideology, which sort of I think put a chip on their shoulder. Not to mention the real grievances that they had, uh, uh, but there's a certain narrative response, particularly with the civil rights movement, where again all the problems in the black community were the faults of whites, meaning that the restrictions that they were
right,
confronted with, particularly in the South, or whether even in the North, restrictions has to do with sort of you could say sort of white racism, as opposed to often it was a way to deal with bad black behavior, which is very common.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a way, it was a debate about causality.
Hmm.
In the segregated South, you did have blacks subjected to certain disabilities, and you also had uh, great differences in wealth and social status among whites and blacks. And so you can understand how it was easy for some people to say, well, the one must be causing the other. It must be that whites restricting blacks' chances in life causes blacks to be poorer or not to do as well in school.
This is
And of course,
particularly true if you happen to live in Vermont or Minnesota, where you don't know any blacks, right?
right, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Which you got a lot. Yeah, basically Northerners looking down on the South as retrograde and backward. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes. Certainly the communists from New York City look down on the South that way.
yeah.
Yeah,
Without having any experience. Oh, that's an old trick because you had Uncle Tom's Cabin written by a gal who never stepped foot in the South, right? It was just
right.
agitprop and with these cartoonish characters. And to this day, you have high schools reading that book
Yeah, yeah.
as if it's some sort of real portrayal of life in the South, and before the Civil War, antebellum South, and it's agitprop. It
Yeah,
was,
it's just her own um what do you call it? Sentimental imagination.
yeah, same thing. Even a century later with To Kill a Mockingbird, which
Same thing. Yeah, really. Yeah,
it was
although
commit.
that was that the author of To Kill a Mockingbird was a genuine Southerner at least.
Yes, and apparently her sequel to that, I haven't read the sequel, but where there is some in her sequel to that, which came out about 10 years ago. There's some discussions about the conditions of the South and how blacks are treated that's more fair actually. But
Hmm.
that book was political agitprop that was commissioned for political purposes because it was the 1960s and the civil rights push, and that of course the whole narrative of the white girl coming on to the black guy and falsely accusing him of rape is an interesting narrative. Apparently, it was the inspiration for the story goes back to her father, where there's actually, funny enough, the case was born out of a white person being assaulted.
Oh. I actually reviewed Harper Lee's book. What was the later book called?
I
Something
forget.
about a
I heard
trumpet or something.
something like that. Yeah, and
Yeah, I actually did a review of it for American Renaissance, and in the course of doing it, I went back and read the To Kill a Mockingbird for the first time in decades. It was the so-called sequel was actually like the original draft that she first submitted
that's what I heard. Yes,
to the publisher, and she had this editor who basically told her to rewrite. The editor was very, very influential on what eventually came out as To Kill a Mockingbird, and it was almost as much her work as Harper Lee's, uh, and made it a more appealing story. Like in the Harper Lee's original story, she was like I think a young adult, and her editor said, "Oh no, you need to make it from a child's point of view," and
Scout. Yeah,
a lot of
Scout.
other
Yeah, yeah.
changes were made in that way. You can actually find that on American Renaissance, my discussion of that, if you look around.
That's a similar thing. There was a back in the '90s a movie called A Time to Kill that was based on a John Grisham novel, and it's about a story of a black girl who's set upon by two white rednecks.
Oh,
They
yeah.
rape her, leave her for dead, and the father, out of revenge, shoots the two assailants dead as they're being arraigned in court, and it's about his trial. And it was adapted to a movie with Matthew McConaughey and Sandra Bullock, mid '90s sometime. And I'm reading about the origins of the story. And John Gresham wrote about it. The story was inspired by a real case, but in the real case, it involved a paroled black ex-convict or paroled black ex-con raping two white girls.
Yeah, right, right.
So it's like,
True crime with the races switched. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
how that works.
It's
But
it ought to be, there ought to be a name for this. I actually suggested to a friend once that we could call it like racial surrealism or something. You just you take the races and reverse them, but keep everything else more or less realistic. And
I've read some of the original. Maybe you recall the inspiration to Kill a Mockingbird. The case involved a white guy with a damaged arm who was killed by a black assailant. I
I
might
don't
have
know.
that detail
Yeah, I
wrong,
don't.
but I might have that wrong. But I thought that was ironic though, because remember the story
Okay.
is that the guy is proven innocent because of his arm is he can't function his right arm. That's where
No.
Atticus Finch proves that he couldn't have, you know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, it turns out that the father hit the girl. That's in
Yeah.
To Kill a Mockingbird. But the remember the because he found out that she had made a pass to a black guy, you know, and so that's the story of To Kill a Mockingbird. That's why the jury has to convict and all that. But it's again, it's one of these. It's all a function of narrative, if you will. It's just what you want to stress, what you want to promote, and has very little to do with reality. The final analysis. But my point is that when you create a narrative of race relations, and one side is all bad, the other side is noble and a victim. Well, that's not reality. And if you
Right.
devise policy based on that, whether it's forced busing, forced integration, or lax law enforcement because you're blaming the victim, you're not going to solve any problems. You're just going to make things a lot worse for everybody. You know,
Right.
because again, you're not engaging with reality, and you're dealing with fundamental differences or inequalities, if you will, that are going to frustrate or vex any social engineering scheme because you're dealing with the complexity of human behavior, which it just doesn't always. It's not something that we can divine or purely understand.
Mm, mm,
In these things.
yeah.
But in terms of that we have this idea of equality, though, when you use differences between be done in sports and achievement and crime. But in the West, we're obsessed with trying to create equality because that's somehow equated with freedom and voting and that sort of thing. And everyone has to participate. But we know that we can't have the same level of participation in things, particularly with men and women, without creating all types of problems, particularly a fertility crisis or a
Hmm.
birth rate collapse. If you have women working in the workforce as much as men do, you have the collapse of the birth rate, and pretty
Right.
soon you have labor shortages, and then you got to you got to bus in cheap labor to fill the breach, and pretty soon you no longer have a nation anymore.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yes, that's what happens when you take an economic view of reality. People thought, well, if women work, the country will get wealthy quicker or something. But if women work and don't have babies, we won't have a country pretty soon. So,
Well, there's a qualitative difference between women. Like a good example, a woman can be a mother and raise children, or that she can be a call girl, right? Being the call girl
yes.
actually might boost GDP statistically, right?
Oh, yes, yes. Well, yeah, they count all kinds of things, all kinds of bad things, as GDP, right? Don't I guess GDP can be boosted by dope dealers and all kinds of vicious behavior.
Well, yeah, gamble online betting boosts GDP, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But it's qualitatively different than say having a factory,
Right, right,
right?
yeah,
You
right,
know,
right.
or look what they do with like stock prices, right? Stock valuations. That's a sign of it's not necessarily. If anything, it's as Wall Street becomes decoupled from reality, it's not a sign of economic health. It's actually it's indication it's getting worse. There's that Catherine Austin Fitts has the popsicle index. And she says, as the Dow Jones Industrial Average has gone up, the quality of life in America has gone down. Now, why is that? Because corporate profits, they're making profits off producing goods or promoting things that are actually making life worse for people.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and what economic model addresses that issue? Well, it's not, because economics isn't the whole thing. Economics is a subset of morality, and you have to apply economics to morality. Like human behavior is always a moral issue.
That's right.
Purposeful human behavior is a moral issue, and obviously economics is a purposeful human behavior. So you have to subordinate to morality. But then you're getting into another issue, aren't you? Getting the more matter of moral philosophy.
Yes,
And
the ancients knew this. Like Plato and Aristotle knew that you couldn't really separate economic issues from moral questions. But modern economic science is all based on the fact value distinction, and that's where you get call girls and online gambling contributing to GDP. You just nobody's willing to say this is better than that. Again, I guess it's a type of egalitarianism really run amok. People want to say that everybody's equal. The call girl's equal to the mother of 10 children.
yeah, and now it's like it's sex work, and
Right.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Right.
and they don't, and it's another example of someone not engaging in reality. Is the reality of why a young woman would do that? What's lacking in her life? What has she experienced, whether it's abuse at home or abandonment and these things? But these things don't matter because it's all equal, because you can't impose morality on it or value judgment on
Right.
it, because it's all the same. Um, but yeah, the economic problem goes back to probably sort of the Manchester School, and Adam Smith, and Sir Isaac Newton, and the idea when they took teleology out of it, and economics became more of a question of physics or mechanics. And,
Yeah. 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 Purely mechanical discipline. Hmm.
and so you get a profit loss, ebb and flow, that sort of thing. And it's just a justification for plunder and exploitation, because you had the enclosure movements, where the people were deprived of the common use of the land because they wanted to sell wool, I think, to Italy for clothes, make a quick profit, and that was more profitable than, say, having the traditional, way the land was distributed. And then all of a sudden you have the surplus population that you can now exploit for the factories, right? And all this
Yeah.
needs to be justified, and it's finding a justification. Not to mention the opium trade and the slave trade, of course, which needed to be
Hmm.
justified. But again, you're divorcing economics, which is human behavior, from morality, and that's not going to work out well in the long term.
Right. Right.
But again, it get back to the inequality and the division of labor, is that you stick at all these differences. You look something as pathological as crime, but if you're not dealing with that reality, you're not going to deal with crime effectively. And a good example
You
is,
could probably treat it as a contribution to GDP.
that's true, because Amazon, when you all that looting, a lot of those
Yeah.
goods were laundered, I think, were at Amazon,
Yeah.
or the various websites where you can sell stuff. But this is why, if you look around some of these cities that have this horrible crime, and have you noticed all the police chiefs, either they're a black guy or some sort of like grandmother who's a police chief,
No. No, but I
because
believe you.
because of DEI and
Yeah.
equality.
Right.
It's like there's no responsible looking person in these positions anywhere, have they don't exert any authority or credibility in those positions. And it's all, again, this pursuit of equality, you know and that, like idea that a grandmother can be as good as police chief as a 55-year-old man who's, yeah, but not, okay,
Decades of experience on the street.
yeah, because
There have been some I guess tragicomic cases in recently of female cops being sent to subdue criminals, and on film it can look positively comical to see these guys throwing these female cops around like King Kong on the top of the Empire State Building, throwing Fay Ray around. I mean, it's just absurd. These little tiny women, you dress them up in blue uniforms and act as if you've got a cop.
Well, there was that cop in England got punched in the nose and started crying. She was trying to subdue a suspect, and he just
Mm.
popped her in the nose, and he had three other cops attend to her. She was crying out of
Yeah,
shock.
yeah, right, right. Oh, there've been and there've been cases a generation ago. I mean, I know there were cases where people have been killed this way, where some little woman is assigned to be like the cop in a courtroom, and some big black suspect just runs up and disarms her and takes her gun and starts shooting people. Stuff like that has happened.
Yeah, there was one where a lady was assigned to transporting him. I remember that. That was like 20 years ago. And why would you have a 110-pound woman charged with transporting this 230-pound,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know? It's like, and of course, it's also they're more likely to resort to like using their weapon, their gun, because they don't have
Yes, right,
physical force. Yeah.
right. Yes,
Now there are some instances I think where a lady, female officer can actually help because they can disarm psychologically something. You're obviously not going to say there's a legitimate role for women in law enforcement, but your typical beat cop where
yes.
isn't that's not
They're
where you
always
want them.
dependent upon men in a way that men aren't on women. Yeah,
Yeah, and again, they're more likely to pull out their gun because they can't deal. They don't have brawn on their side.
right.
To deal
Yeah.
with these things. It's just not, again, an example of just not dealing because they want to meet a quota and meet this fantasy of equality. They create a much more dangerous situation.
Yes, you
You know,
exactly.
and not to mention, with what's happened with competency.
Hmm.
Throughout the West, where again, where you're dealing with a situation for certain technical fields, scientific fields, you're not going to have too many blacks or Hispanics. You're going to have a lot of Asians and ethnic whites, and that offends a lot of people because again, this violates the tenets of equality. And but
Anytime anytime you mix in another motive besides people being best at their job, it's going to take away from competency.
mhm,
It's um, uh, diversity, as they call it, is simply it's going to affect competency simply because it isn't competency. It's a competing ideal. It's a competing effort. And so, what you give to the diversity is taken away from the pursuit of competence. It would be the
yeah,
same for any other ideal that was in competition with, appointing the best people for the job.
yeah. I was listening to this was a speech by Shelby Steele,
Yes.
and he was talking about the civil rights movement and in the 1960s, and then what was expected. And he was saying it was very hard. He says if you take a people who are they're economically on the lower rung, educational, they don't have the skills. It's going to take some time for them to catch up, to close that gap, if you will, and you can't force it. And he was saying that's a hard thing to accept. The very hard thing. He says it may never close, as you and I are
Right.
talking about, because maybe it shouldn't close. Why is that? A priori, why is that a priori considered a good thing? That itself is why? Because there are differences. Maybe it shouldn't
It,
close. And if it
it,
can't close,
it well, racial differences came to be over the course of evolutionary time, where you have to be thinking in thousands and 10,000s and hundreds of thousands of years. And the civil rights movement was made by politicians who think in terms of the next election.
good point. Yes.
And so you have these racial differences. They are not absolutely timeless, like the much discussed 15-point difference between average IQs of American blacks and whites. It's not inevitable that that will be true from now until doomsday. It could change, but it's only likely to change over the course of many, many generations, and it may not even change in a way that we want. It may change by right now we've got dysgenic fertility, and everybody's getting stupider. So
Hmm.
yeah, So yeah, change is possible, but it's not necessarily the change that we would wish for, and you must think in terms of evolutionary time, not political time, not the time that we think of in regard to political action.
which is every 2 to 4 years, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And of course, we wouldn't have a $38 trillion national debt if
Right.
politicians weren't in the business of making promises they can't keep or pay for.
Yes, yes, yes.
It's like, and it's yeah, it is. You make all these promises, and this is going to happen, and then at the same time, they're promoting policies. A good example is welfare and destruction of the black family, promoting sexual degeneracy, which breeds violence in the final analysis because it promotes family breakup, and then you subject more people to more trauma because you have people who are living in broken homes. But
Yeah.
I mean, there was some acknowledgement of this back in the '60s, the Moynihan report, when he was observing the disastrous
Yes.
black illegitimacy rate of 22%.
Yes, right,
It's like, I think the national average is 30%. I think it's 40% with whites. It's like 28%. But for blacks now, it's getting up to 80%.
right.
You
Yeah,
know,
we would wish to have a white illegitimacy rate as low as the black one was when Moynihan wrote his report. I think
yes, yes.
that'd be an improvement.
But in order to impose what Moynihan wanted, was he wanted to impose basically this was sort of Christian Catholic social teaching applied to law. He was a Catholic, um, but his idea was to stabilize the black family, promote male employment, particularly like mail services, high paying, decent paying jobs, so they could have fathers. But that was
Yes.
patriarchal. That ran counter to the spirit of the age, which is sexual liberation, feminism, and these things. So you promoted sexual liberation in the black community. Already, their grip on sexual morality was tenuous, to say the
Yes.
least, and it was just a disaster. And so
Yes.
it's like they're working across purposes. We want equality of this and that. We want equality in the sciences and in achievement, but you're destroying the foundation for that, which is a stable family, discipline, and order in people's lives. You promote chaos in the name of freedom, you're going to get chaos in people's lives. You're going to get political, social chaos. But then if you make that acknowledgement, you're imposing your morality on somebody. But there's consequences for that, you see.
When white standards were unapologetically enforced in the black community, most blacks did get married
Yes.
and raise families, and they were able to benefit from these institutions that are not really their own. The most polygamous part of the world is West Africa.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, when the sexual revolution hit blacks worse than any other group, the old West African patterns, mating patterns, just came roaring back very, very quickly.
Yeah, there was I forget his name. There was a sociologist, a black sociologist in the '30s. He did a study on patterns of black families in the post-Civil War South, and he just found that blacks that had families did very well,
Yeah.
and the ones that didn't had trouble. And so this perdures, and this is because it provides, if you impose a case strategy on them, which white society would do. And again,
Yes.
when whites
Yeah.
are unapologetic, you oppose that case strategy on them. They may not be equal, but they improve, and that's, to me,
Right. Yes.
that should be the objective. To me, improvement is the key. It's like, you
Yes,
know,
you should be less interested in making everybody equal and more interested in getting everybody to improve.
yeah, but that requires sort of, I guess, a moral, objective morality, and
Yes, it does.
but everything runs counter to our age, to modernity.
Yes.
But again, if you promote everything that promotes family dissolution, promotes chaos, no discipline, obviously you have a group that's I think more marginal, like blacks. It's going to hit them a lot harder, and you're going to the collapse is going to be much more extreme, as we saw with crime
That's
rates and this.
one legitimate beef that blacks have. They were hit terribly by the welfare system and its perverse incentives.
Mhm.
They were the first hit and the worst hit of all American groups.
Mhm. And again, the idea that not to mention the effects of forced integration, whereas you deny
Yes.
them their own elite to basically form their own communities.
Yes, that's right.
You know,
Yes. Yeah, yeah. When you have all black schools, you get a natural black elite that becomes like the yeah the the natural models, the natural role models, and the natural leaders of that community.
There's Dunbar High School famously Dunbar High School in Washington D.C., which had high achievement.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Again, just one, yeah, it's you know. uh, Again, the idea, I guess, the narrative that they were victims, therefore they need to a hand up, not a handout, as Lyndon Johnson said, right?
Yeah.
But inevitably, because it promoted everything, again, promoted single parents, families, because of welfare, and they rejected the Moynihan Report's idea of promoting black fathers, and so whatever
Mm.
problems existed, and whatever inclinations or whatever shortcomings they may have, or given their temperaments, it was made a lot worse. Because again, you can, if you impose case strategy and you impose high standards, you do get improvement. And to
Yes.
me, and that should be the goal, you
That's
know.
why, yeah, America has like the wealthiest black population in the world,
hmm
because we did this for so long,
hmm
held them to our own standards.
That you saw that, basically, yeah, they developed human capital and skills. And well, I mean, we saw that because the idea of white supremacy, what does that mean? It means white standards. Well, you're living in a European society, so you have to
Yes.
abide by those standards, and you will, and it will be an improvement for you, spiritually and materially. But remember, it was a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the African American Museum, Smithsonian, had a placard out front that had listed attributes of white supremacy.
Oh, yes. Being on time for work and studying and
Punctuality,
following the
politeness.
rules. Yeah.
Yeah. And okay, if you don't follow those, you get Jackson, Mississippi, you get Detroit, you get Baltimore, you get the south side of Chicago. You know,
Yeah.
there are consequences. You know, Again, the goal should be improvement, ever improving, which is possible with outside social engineering and the sort of this fantasy of universal equality, which is again, it's political Lysenkoism. And with Lysenkoism, you got a famine with wheat. Well, with political Lysenkoism, you get modern America, right? That's not that
Yeah.
seems to be descending into the Civil War as we speak. So, well, I said I'd have you for an hour,
Yes, we've been about an hour.
so I want to thank you for coming back on the show.
I've enjoyed it.
And so, of course, the article itself, it was at UNS. You said you wrote it a few years ago, right?
I think the site I originally wrote it for isn't even online anymore, but
Okay.
it was picked up by American Renaissance. You can easily find it there or at UNS. It's called the Intelligent Person's Guide to Race and Racial Differences.
I'll provide the link, and thank you.
All right, thank you, Tim.
Good
Bye
night, then.
bye.
Take care.